Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive with us. Even the most confident people can get tripped up by grammar. It happens to all of us, right?
Oh, absolutely. And it's probably more common than we think.
Well, today we're going to dive into some of the most common mistakes that we see. We found a great episode of the English Daily Podcast, and they break down 7 blunders. And these aren't just for English language learners. Even fluent speakers make these mistakes all the time. So let's jump right into the first one, shall we?
Sounds good to me.
All right. This first one is a classic. It's the mix-up of your and your. Have you ever accidentally used the wrong one?
Oh, yeah. All the time online, especially, it's so easy to do.
Yeah, I feel like those little apostrophes, they can be tricky sometimes.
Absolutely. But context really matters here. Like if you're writing a formal email and you use your instead of your, it can make you look like you weren't paying attention to detail.
It's almost like showing up to a job interview in your pajamas. It's not the best first impression.
Right, exactly.
The podcast actually had a good tip for this one. They said if you can replace the word with you are, then your is the correct choice.
Yeah, that makes you stop and think about what you're actually trying to say.
Okay, so are you ready to tackle the next grammar gremlin?
Hit me with it.
Okay. This one is a trio of words that cause mass confusion. There, and there.
Yes, the homophones that plague us all.
But don't worry, there's an easy way to keep them straight. So think of there as a location, like over there.
Oh, I like that.
Right, it kind of paints a picture in your mind.
Yeah. And then there shows possession, so I always think of it like a pirate guarding their treasure.
Okay, that one is definitely going to my memory bank.
Yeah.
How about there?
There is just a shortened version of they are. Easy peasy.
There. Okay, I think we conquered those. Now on to a mistake that I know I've made a few times myself. Subject-verb agreement. It sounds really complicated, but it's basically making sure your verbs match up with your subjects. So a singular subject needs a singular verb, and a plural subject needs a plural verb.
Exactly. And it seems straightforward enough, but a lot of these errors, they come from the way we speak. We often drop those endings in casual conversation, but when you're writing, it's important to maintain that agreement.
Like in that example they had in the podcast, she don't like coffee.
Right. It should be she doesn't like coffee. It's a subtle thing, but it makes a big difference.
Totally. Okay, what about double negatives? This one always makes me chuckle a bit because they use the example, I don't need no help. Have you ever heard that?
Oh, yeah, all the time. It almost sounds right, doesn't it?
It does. But why is it wrong?
Well, because in English, two negatives actually cancel each other out. So when you say, I don't need no help, it actually means you do need help.
Oh, so it's like a math equation. 2 negatives make a positive.
Exactly. The correct way to say it is, I don't need any help.
Got it. Okay, how about misplaced modifiers? I'll be honest. This is one that always trips me up. I love the example they gave. Running to the bus, the backpack fell off. It sounds like the backpack is running for the bus.
That's exactly the problem with misplaced modifiers. They create these illogical interpretations, which are sometimes really funny.
They are. So what exactly is a modifier?
It's a word or a phrase that describes another word or phrase. The trick is to place it close to the word it's describing so there's no confusion.
So it should be while running to the bus, I dropped my backpack.
Exactly. That way it's crystal clear who is doing the running.
Okay. This next word is a little more subtle. It's overusing prepositions. To be honest, I'm not even sure I always recognize when I'm doing it.
So prepositions, those are words like on, in, at, to, and from. They show the relationship between a noun or a pronoun and another word in the sentence. We often add them in when we don't really need to.
I see, yeah. The podcast gave the example where you at versus where are you.
Right. You see how the second one is shorter and gets the point across. Sometimes the meaning is clear without the extra preposition.
So how do you know when a preposition isn't necessary?
It's all about recognizing when that phrase is actually adding to the clarity. A lot of times you can just say it simply and it means the same thing.
Okay, last one for this part of our deep dive. Incorrect comparisons. The example was, she's more smarter than him, when it should just be, she's smarter than him.
Yes.
I can see why that's wrong, but what's the rule?
So the rule is, you don't need to be redundant when you're comparing things. Smarter already implies a comparison. You don't need to add more.
So it's either more intelligent or smarter, but never both.
Exactly. It's a really common mistake, but an easy fix once you know the rule.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground already. Let's take a quick break, and then we'll be back to dive even deeper into these grammar mistakes and talk about why they matter.
Welcome back.
All right, so we've identified these common mistakes. But why do even fluent English speakers keep making them? It's like, we know the rules, but we still trip up.
It's true. And the podcast actually talked about this a bit. They pointed out that one reason is because of how we speak. We're so used to speaking in a more casual way.
Yeah, we use contractions all the time. Slang. We even leave sentences unfinished when we're just chatting with friends.
Exactly. But then sometimes those habits kind of sneak into our writing, especially if we're writing quickly or not really paying attention to our grammar.
It's like our brains have two different modes, one for speaking and one for writing.
It's almost like two separate languages, isn't it?
Yeah. And I guess it makes sense because when we're speaking, we rely on things like tone of voice and facial expressions to get our meaning across.
Right, and we can clarify if someone doesn't understand us. But in writing, we have to be much more precise with our language.
So how do we train our brains to switch to that more formal mode when we're writing? The podcast mentioned practice and awareness, but what does that actually look like in everyday life?
Well, first off, I think it's super important to just pay attention to your grammar. And not just when you're writing, but also when you're reading.
So like noticing how other writers use language.
Exactly. Pay attention to the grammar rules they follow. The more you surround yourself with good writing, the more it will become second nature to you.
It's like learning to cook by watching a master chef, right?
Exactly. And the podcast also suggested reading as much as possible.
Yeah.
I completely agree with that. It's such a great way to absorb good grammar naturally.
Pick up a book, a magazine article, even a blog post. And don't forget proofreading. I know it can be a drag, but it's so important.
It is. It's your chance to catch those little errors that might have slipped through.
Do you have any tips for proofreading? I'm always rushing through it, especially when I have a deadline.
One trick that I like to use is to change the font or even print out my work before I proofread. It makes my brain see the text in a new way, so I'm more likely to spot mistakes.
Oh, that's a good idea. And of course, there are grammar checkers.
Right, those can be super helpful, but it's important to remember that they aren't perfect.
Yeah, they can be a good guide, but you still need to understand the rules yourself.
Exactly. Don't just blindly accept their suggestions.
Well, this has been really eye-opening. I'm already starting to look at grammar in a whole new way.
I'm glad to hear that. It's a journey, not a destination, right? We all make mistakes. The important thing is to keep learning and improving.
But before we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I want to talk about the bigger picture. We've talked about all these rules and tips, but why does good grammar really matter? What impact does it have on our lives?
That's a great question, and one that I think deserves more attention. We'll dive into that when we come back for the final part of our deep dive.
And we're back for the final part of our deep dive into these common grammar mistakes.
It's been quite a journey, hasn't it?
It has. We started with apostrophes, and now we're talking about the bigger picture of grammar. Why does it even matter? What impact does it really have?
That's something that the podcast didn't really touch on. They were focused on the mechanics of grammar, but I think it's so important to talk about why it's crucial for good communication.
It's like you can have all the ingredients for a cake, but if you don't know how to bake it, it's not going to turn out very well.
Exactly. You can have all the right words, but if you don't know how to put them together in a grammatically correct way, your message might not make sense.
Right. So it's not about sounding smart. It's about making sure that people understand you.
Precisely. Imagine this. When your grammar is good, your writing is like a clear window. Your reader can see your ideas without any distractions.
But if your grammar is off, it's like a dirty window. It's hard to see clearly, and people might just give up trying to figure out what you're saying.
And that can have some serious consequences, especially in professional settings.
Oh, I bet. Like in a job application. Or even an online dating profile.
Absolutely. A well-written cover letter with perfect grammar, that's going to stand out, and online dating. Good grammar can show that you're intelligent and pay attention to detail.
It's like dressing up for a first date, but for your words.
Exactly. You're putting your best foot forward.
And good grammar isn't just about appearances, right? Doesn't it also affect how people perceive your message?
You're absolutely right. When you write clearly and correctly, people are more likely to trust what you're saying. They'll see you as credible.
But if your writing is full of mistakes, it can make you seem careless.
Exactly. And it can undermine your message no matter how important it is.
So good grammar isn't just about following some arbitrary rules. It's about respecting your readers.
And making sure that your message is heard.
Well said. It's about connecting with your audience and building trust. This has been such a fascinating conversation. We've covered so much.
We have, from common mistakes to tips for improvement, and even the bigger picture of why grammar matters.
And I think the biggest takeaway is that good grammar is a journey. It's something we can all work on. But before we sign off, I have one last question for you. We've talked about how language is always changing, especially online with all the slang and shortcuts. How do you think this is affecting our ability to communicate in more formal settings?
Wow, that's a great question. And it's one that deserves its own deep dive.
Well, I guess we'll have to save that for another episode.
Sounds like a plan.
Thanks for joining us on this grammar adventure.
It's been a pleasure.
And remember, keep practicing, keep learning, and don't be afraid to make mistakes along the way. That's how we all improve.
Couldn't agree more.
Until next time, everyone.